Hi, and welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman, and today I have a great scrappy quilt for you, and it is so easy and fun to put together. Let's check it out. Here is a sampling of the quilt that I'm starting to put together using my scraps. I have simply grabbed my 3-inch container of squares and my 5-inch container of squares. I have a lot of these. And what I am doing, as you see here, I'm using the colored 5-inch squares, and I'm using light 3-inch squares to make this quilt. In fact, this is a quilt that you can use just about any size squares you might have in your stash. Let me show you what I mean. I'm calling this quilt, as I designed it, it looked like spirals or ribbons going on a diagonal there. And so I'm calling it Scrappy Spirals. And I realized as I was working with this and putting it together, you can use any size squares you want. What I'm using is a 5-inch square and a 3-inch square for snowballing. And I'm giving you the information here. If you have 6-inch squares that you have a lot of and would like to use them, then you would use a 4-inch light square for snowballing. If you have 7-inch squares, you'd use a 5-inch light square for snowballing. So basically all we're doing is snowballing each of, in my case, the 5-inch squares, and in your case, you might be using a different size. I've given you the information all the way up to a 10-inch square where you would use an 8-inch square for snowballing. And so that is basically how you're doing it. Each snowball would be 2 inches smaller than the main square that you're using. Very simple, very fast, and as you are putting this together and creating the snowballs, you're also creating an additional half-square triangle that you could save and use in your border. You'll see on here, I'm just putting a plain border in there, but you could certainly use the additional half-square triangles and put those in the border. This PDF is in the description box below. It's also out on my website, quiltingwithlori.com, and you can find it out there under the blog that coordinates with this particular quilt. So you can find it in either places in case you're not able to access the description box below. But this gives you all the information. So let's say you have a 6-inch square and you've got a lot of those, you want to use those, then you could simply pull some 4-inch light squares to snowball. And I'll show you the snowballing technique in just a moment. Here is a 7-inch square, and I simply pulled a 5-inch light square, and I'm going to snowball that. So that takes care of that. If you have an 8-inch square, maybe you've got a lot of those, you could grab a 6-inch light square and snowball that. And here's a 9-inch with a 7-inch snowball, and here's a 10-inch with an 8-inch snowball. So it's something that you can use with almost any size that you have in your stash. And if you don't yet have a stash, you might want to check out my video tutorial, and I'll have the video link below in the description box, where you can go out and find out how my speedy solutions to cut and organize your scrap stash. This takes you step by step on how you can get through your scraps, get them cut, sorted, organized, stored, and ready to use to make beautiful quilts. There are 5 scrappy quilt patterns in this book, and there's another 12 scrappy quilt patterns in the patterns book. This book does use these techniques. And of course, with all the patterns in this, you can certainly just use yardage if that's what you have as well. In fact, for this quilt that we're doing today, you could simply use a yardage that you have, maybe a blue and a white, whatever you want. This is a very versatile pattern. You can do so much with it. So I'm still working on my quilt. I want it to be much bigger than this, but I wanted to get a sampling ready for you so that you can see what it's looking like. I'm going to do 5 more blocks, and I'm going to take you to the sewing machine so that you can see how I snowball them and how I also end up with an additional half-square triangle unit when I'm doing that snowball, just by adding another line of stitching, and I'll show you that in just a moment as well. To simplify sewing these snowballs, or snowballing these squares, I am using a tape. It's a 1/4-inch tape, And unfortunately, I've thrown away the packaging on this. So I don't know the name of it. If anyone knows the name of it, if you could please comment below and let us know. But they're wonderful, and you can actually tape these to your sewing machine bed right in front of your needle. So the red line would be placed right where the needle is, and it would come toward you, and then you have exact 1/4-inch seam allowances that are on each side, and you're able to guide your square using this tape. Let me show you. So as you can see here, I've placed my tape starting, I've made sure that the red line is lined up with the needle, and I've just started right up there, and I've lined it up, and it's coming straight off the bed of the machine. And then the 1/4-inch lines are on both sides. What I'm using is basically this red line. And when I line up each of my pieces of fabric to snowball, I'm going to line up this point on that red line right next to the needle. And then when I'm sewing, I'm going to be watching the red line here. I'm not going to be watching the needle. I'm going to be watching this line as I sew. And I'm trying to make sure that that point stays right on that red line. That means I don't have to draw lines on each and every one of these squares for the snowballing. So I've sewn all of this whole row here of snowball squares, so they're all ready to go. But I want to make half square triangle units out of this leftover piece here that I'm going to eventually cut away. That way it will be something that I can use maybe in the border of this quilt or in another project. And you can simply move your tape back and forth to help you with this measurement. I am simply eyeing it. I'm not moving my needle, my foot, or my tape. I am just eyeing it so that I have approximately a 1/4-inch seam allowance for both of these units, actually for all of the units that I'm sewing. So now what I can do when I cut this apart in between here, I'll end up with a half square triangle unit that I can use for the border or another project. And I'll also have my snowballed square. So I've cut some of these apart already. And here is the half square triangle that I trimmed away. So I trimmed this apart, and now I have half square triangle. I'll trim that up probably to a 2-inch half square triangle unit and use that for later. And then I will press this open so that it's snowballed, and then square up each unit to 5 inches. Always square up your unit to the size of this original block, and that way everything will be done correctly. And I'm going to show you how I'm squaring them up to make sure that each and every block is squared up the same. So let me show you how I'm cutting those apart. It's kind of hard to see the stitching. Let me see, maybe, I guess you can't really see the stitching on either of those, but I have 2 lines of stitching on each of these as I snowballed it. So the first line of stitching was from the corner to the corner, and then I brought it around and I stitched again about 1/2 inch away approximately. And now what I'm going to do with each of these, and you can cut these with a rotary cutter on your mat or simply with your scissors. I'm cutting them apart. I've got a half square triangle unit here, and I've got a snowball unit. And this is the unit we're going to use for the center of the quilt. And these are units you could use in the border. I found that it works best when you're squaring up each of these to whatever size the main square is. In my case, that they happen to be 5 inches. I always want to make sure that I'm squaring them up all the same. In my case, I made sure that my blocks always, or my squares, always were placed on my cutting mat like this. I found my 5-inch mark here and up here, and then I would trim away from this side. And I wanted just to make sure that everything, that was my first cut. I always made sure that I started with my first cut right there and trim that away. And then if I needed to, I'd bring it around. I just think that by doing that, each and every square is going to be more accurate regarding your snowball size. And in this case, I have to come back around. I've got a little bit of extra right over here that needs to be fixed. Not much, a little bit. So that's how I did it. I just made sure that my squares were all placed on my cutting mat to be squared up, with them all going in the exact same direction as I squared them up. Sometime I would have to flip them around then and trim off some little edges that might not be accurate. But the first cut was always with the square going in the same direction. Now, how do you place these squares in your quilt? Let's check that out. So when you're placing your squares in your rows, it's very, very simple. Let me move this out of the way here. You'll notice in this row here, the snowball is at the bottom right. Here it's at the top left. And for you, it's just the reverse. Here it's down, here it's up, here it's down. So we're going to do just the reverse as we work across this row. So I am putting it, whoops, let's see here. So it's up, down, up, down, and up. And that's all you have to do as you're putting each row together. Up, down, up, down, up. And you're creating these pretty spirals, these ribbons, if you will, across the quilt. Again, you can make this as scrappy as you'd like. I think it would be beautiful with a large border on the outside and maybe putting in some applique, maybe some floral or some fun, folksy applique around the outside edge. There's so much you can do with this. I hope that you'll all experiment and really have fun with it. And I would love to see pictures. So for those of you who are going to make this, please be sure to post photos of them out on my Facebook group page, Quilting with Lori, Scrap Up Your Stash. Find that out on Facebook and post photos of what you're making. I'd love to see it. But you'll see here that the light colored blocks, you don't really match anything. There should be about 1/4 of an inch of the white that you see all the way through. It's not exact on mine, and you know what? I'm not going to worry about it. This is a nice scrappy quilt. I'm not going to submit this to be judged. This is just a fun quilt that I'm going to make using up my scrap stash, and that's the goal, is to use up scraps. I moved the camera up a little bit so you could see more of the quilt. And of course, this last row here I have not yet sewn. And as I mentioned, you're not really matching any seams. You might see about 1/4 of an inch or so where the white kind of matches as you're going down the row. But it really is a very easy quilt to put together where you don't have to worry about matching seams. Very scrappy, really fun. You could certainly use yardage, a light and a bright, or a light and a dark, whatever your choice is on fabric. But there's so much you could do with this quilt. I hope you'll enjoy making the Scrappy Spirals quilt. And until next time, thank you so much for stopping by, and happy quilting.